I'm Michaela Peterson, Jordan's daughter. I hope you enjoy this episode. It's called Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors. We're still in Serbia. Obviously, I was too excited about it being completely open here, and now we're kind of quarantined again. And there are riots. Oops. Hope you're not too cooped up. If you're interested, I released a podcast with Lauren Southern on Tuesday. It's on YouTube and on my podcast under the Michaela Peterson podcast, if you're so inclined to hear what she's been up to, if you know who she is. Also, my dad has a newsletter now that is featuring part of the calls from his newly written unpublished book. If you're interested in receiving a free weekly newsletter from him, please go to his website at jordanbpeterson.com and sign up. Enjoy the episode. Stay sane out there. We should all be optimizing our health right now, and one of the most important ways to do that is by getting proper sleep. For many of us, that depends on having a good mattress. This is why I choose Helix Sleep. I have their mattress at home and wish I had one here in Serbia with me. I miss it desperately. They're rated the #1 mattress by GQ and Wired, and CNN called it the most comfortable mattress they've ever slept on. The best part is they're customized to fit your exact sleeping needs. Helix even has a quiz that takes just 2 minutes and matches your body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for you. And if you and your significant other hate the same type of mattress, you can get one that's split down the middle made for each of you. No need to snuggle ever again. Kidding, but seriously, just go to helixsleep.com/Jordan, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress that will give you the best sleep of your life. Right now, Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders at helixsleep.com/Jordan. Get up to $200 off at helixsleep.com/Jordan. Season 3, Episode 15, Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors, a Jordan B. Peterson lecture.
That's a hell of a welcome for someone who's going to talk about the Bible. So, I thought I would get farther than through Genesis by this point, but I'm not unhappy about the pace either. I've learned a tremendous amount, and so hopefully what we'll do today is finish Genesis completely. And then I think I'll try to start up with Exodus in May, depending on what happens next year. I have a busy travel schedule, but I would really like to do it. I really like the Exodus story, and I understand it very well. A lot of the stories in Genesis, especially after the first few stories, say up to the Tower of Babel, I had to do a tremendous amount of learning about, which is really good, but I do know the Exodus story, so I'm really looking forward to that. So let's dive right into it and see how far we can get today. So we'll review first. So Joseph's father is Jacob, and Jacob is the patriarch of Israel, essentially, the father of the 12 tribes. And you might remember that he had a very morally ambivalent pathway through life. And it's one of the things that I think so interesting about the stories in the Old Testament is that these so-called patriarchal figures are very realistic, and it's something that I was also been struck by that accounts in the New Testament that way. There's lots of things that Christ does that you'd think would have been edited out over time and sanitized, but they're not. And the Old Testament is definitely not a book that's been sanitized, and it's quite interesting that that's the case. So you sort of see people with all their flaws. And I've been trying to also derive some general conclusions about the moral of the story, of the Genesis stories, and because these stories are fundamentally moral. And moral, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with action, right? Because moral decisions are the decisions that you make when you're structuring action. When you decide to do one thing or another, generally you want to do things that are the best things that you can think of to do, and hence good, but sometimes you also want to do things that are the worst things you can do, because you're angry or resentful or bitter. And so the moral decisions that you make that govern your actions are really the most important decisions that you make in your life. And it's not that easy to figure out how to make moral decisions. We don't have an unerring technology for that the same way as we do for, say, making decisions about empirical reality, which in some ways seem a lot simpler. Partly because we can work collectively at it, partly because we have a rigorous methodology for deciding what's true and what's not. So one of the things that's really struck me, like it's an overarching theme, I would say, that emerges out of Genesis, especially after the really ancient stories, say, especially after the stories of Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel. When you get to the accounts of the more historically real people, one injunction seems to be, get the hell out there and do something. You know, one of the major themes for all of the patriarchs that we've talked about, Abraham, say Jacob, and Joseph, is move out into the world regardless of the circumstances at hand. Now, that's in the Old Testament stories, that's basically portrayed as hearkening to the voice of God, something like that. Maybe you could think about that as destiny or a psychological calling. And the funny thing, too, is that it's not that these people have an easy time of it when they heed that call. So what's fascinating is that they often run into extreme difficulties right away. And I think that's very interesting, first of all, because life is obviously full of extreme difficulties. And second, it's another example of the failure to sugarcoat things, which is one of the things I think makes a mockery of anti-religious theories that are even quite sophisticated, say like Freud's, because Freud thought of religion as a wish fulfillment, essentially. And also Marx, who thought about religion as the opiate of the masses. If those were true, it seems to me that there'd be a lot more wish and a lot less reality, a lot less stark, harsh reality. You know, I mean, the first thing that Abraham encounters is a famine, and then he has to hide his wife, and then he basically journeys into a tyranny. So that's about as bad as it gets in some ways, and those themes recur continually. And no one ever lives where they're supposed to live. They live in Canaan and not the promised land. And so it's a pretty rough series of stories. But the fundamental idea is something like, there's no time for sitting around. There's time to go out into the world and engage. And then there's hints about the proper and improper ways of engaging, right? So clearly the improper way to engage is, I think, most clearly delineated in the Cain and Abel story. And with Cain exemplifying the inappropriate way to engage with the world, and that's to engage with the world in a bitter, jealous, and resentful manner. Now, one of the things that I really like about the Cain and Abel story, and that theme recurs continually with the duality of the brothers, right? There's constant conflict between a perspective that's essentially like Cain's and the opposite perspective, which I'll get to in a minute. But Cain sees that the world is a very tragic place, and that the rewards are distributed unfairly, and that there are people who do better and people who do worse. And as a consequence of that, he becomes bitter and resentful and curses God, and then he becomes homicidal, fratricidal, which is even worse. Then he destroys his own ideal. Then his descendants basically become genocidal, something like that. So that seems to be the wrong way to go about things, you know, unless your goal is to make things worse. Like, it's not like Cain has a limited number of things, has nothing to object to. He's got plenty to object to. His situation actually is bad. He's overshadowed terribly by his brother, who everyone loves, who does extraordinarily well, and who's good at everything. And the story is a bit ambivalent about the reasons for Cain's failure, although a fair bit of it's laid at his own feet, but he's definitely failing. And so you can understand why he would have this terrible attitude, but the problem is all it does is make it worse. So it doesn't seem to be... One of the things I've also learned as a psychologist, sort of pondering these sorts of things, is that it's often a lot easier to identify what you shouldn't do than what you should do. Like, I think evil is easier to identify than good. I think good is trickier, but evil stands out to some degree. And then at least you can say, if you're trying to get as far away from that as possible, we could even say just for practical reasons, so your life doesn't become hell and your family life doesn't become hell. At least you could get as far away from that as possible, even if you weren't able to conjure up what would constitute the good as an aim. You could at least avoid those sorts of pitfalls. And I do also think that it's pitfalls like that that really threaten our society right now, that I see a tremendous rise in resentment fueling almost all of the political polarization that's taking place. It seems unfortunate given that by and by large, everyone on the planet is richer than they've ever been. Now, that doesn't mean there's no disparity, but there's always disparity. Anyways, Jacob and Rebekah deceive Esau, and Jacob ends up with Isaac's blessing, and so that's a moral catastrophe. And then he has to run because his brother wants to kill him, and so that's the fratricidal motif again. I like that too. I think that's really realistic. One of the things that Freud noted constantly, and this is where Freud really is a genius, is that the most intense hatreds and also sometimes the most intense love is within families, and in the Freudian world of psychopathology, it's all inside the family. In fact, the pathology in the Freudian world is actually the fact that it's all inside the family, because people who get tangled up in the Freudian familial nightmare, which is roughly Oedipal in structure, can only conceptualize the world in terms of their familial relationships. They've been so damaged by the enmeshment and the trauma and the deceit and the betrayal and the blurred lines and all of that, that they just can't expand past the family and go out in the world. So the idea that brothers can be at each other's throats, I think that's a very powerful idea, and it's not something that people like to think about. So Jacob has to leave, and it's not surprising because, what he did was pretty reprehensible. He betrayed his brother. But nonetheless, he's the person who dreams of the ladder that unites heaven and earth. And that's a very perverse thing, But one of the things I think it does is in some sense, it gives hope to everyone, because it isn't, if only the good guys win, we're really in trouble. Right? Because it's not that easy to be a good guy. It's really not that easy, and most people are pretty keenly aware of all the ways that they fall short even of their own ideals. And so if there was no hope except for the good guys, almost all of us would be lost. And so that's one of the things I really liked and was more surprised about with the Old Testament stories, is that these people they have very complex lives, and they make very major moral errors by anyone's standard, and yet the overall message is still hopeful, and the message that runs contrary to the message of evil, say, the message of good, is something like, well, there's a lot of emphasis on faith, right? And that's a tough one, because cynics, people who are cynical about religious structures, like to think of faith as the willingness to demolish your intellect in the service of superstition. And there's something to be said for that perspective, but not a lot, because the reality is much more sophisticated. Part of the faith that is being insisted upon in the Old Testament is something like, and I'm speaking psychologically here again, that it's useful to posit a high good and to aim at it. So, and I really think that's practically useful too. The research we've done with the Future Authoring Program, for example, indicates pretty clearly that if you get people to conceptualize an ideal, and a balanced ideal, so what do you want for your family? What do you want for your career? What do you want for your education? What do you want for your character development? How are you going to use your time outside of work? How are you going to structure your use of drugs and alcohol in places where you might get impulsive? How can you avoid falling into a horrible pit? If you really think that through and you come up with an integrated ideal and you put it above you as something to reach for, then you're more committed to the world in a positive way, and you're less tormented by anxiety and uncertainty. And that makes sense, right? Because here you are alive and everything. And so, unless you were if you're not capable of manifesting some positive relationship with the fact of your being, then how could that be anything other than hellish? Because it would just be anxiety provoking and terrible because you're vulnerable and there'd be nothing useful or worthwhile to do. Well, that's just not, I just can't see that as a winning strategy for anyone. You can make a rational case for adopting that strategy in that, you can say, well, there's no evidence for a transcendent morality or for an ultimate meaning. There's no hard empirical evidence. But it seems to me that there's existential evidence as well that has to be taken into account. And of course, psychologists have talked about this a lot. Carl Rogers, for example, and Jung, for that matter, Freud, for that matter, most of the great psychologists have pointed out that, you can derive reasonable information that's solid from your own experience, especially if you also talk to other people, and you can kind of see in your own life when you're on a productive path that sort of ennobles and enlightens you, or a destructive path. And I think it's kind of useful to think that maybe the dichotomy between those two paths might be real, and because that also allows you to give credence to your intuitions about that sort of thing. But I don't think it's unreasonable to posit that since you're alive, adopting the highest possible regard for the fact that you're alive and that you're surrounded by other creatures that are alive, I just can't see how that can possibly be construed as a losing strategy. And so that's the first thing. So that's something like faith, right? It's faith. It's not only faith in your being, but it's faith in being as such. And the faith would be something like, if you could orient your being properly, then maybe that would orient you with being as such. And you never know. It might be true. There's no reason to assume that it wouldn't be true. Even if you just take a strict biological perspective on this and think about us as the product of 3.5 billion years of evolution, we have struggled over all those billions of years to be alive and to match ourselves with reality. And so, because one of the things I've often wondered is, life is definitely difficult. There's no doubt about that. And it's unfair and there's inequality and all of those things. And people are subject to all sorts of terrible things. But I also wonder, if you weren't actively striving to make things worse, just how much better could they be? Because people are they're like houses that are divided amongst themselves. They're pointing in 6 different directions at the same time. They're working at cross purposes to themselves because of bitterness and resentment and unprocessed memories and childhood hatreds and unexamined assumptions, all sorts of things. And you just got to wonder if you could push that aside and orient yourself properly. And then the other thing that, of course, is stressed very heavily in the Old Testament, and of course that goes through the entire biblical corpus, is that it's not only enough to establish a positive relationship with being, which I think is the essential, it's a good description of faith. You have to make that decision, right? Because being is very ambivalent. And you can make the case that maybe it's something that should have never happened. But that doesn't seem to be productive to me. And faith seems to be, I'm going to act as if being is ultimately justifiable, and that if I partake in it properly, I will improve it rather than making it worse. So I think that's the statement of faith. And then what seems to go along with that is something like truth in conception and action. Even people like Jacob, who are pretty damn morally ambivalent to begin with, get hammered a lot by what they go through. And what seems to happen is that they're hammered into some sort of ethical shape, right? So by the midpoint of their life's journey, there's people who are solidly planted, who you can trust and who don't betray being or themselves or their fellow man. And so it's an interesting, it seems reasonable to me to first assume that you have to establish a relationship with something that's transcendent. It might even be just the future version of you. And then second, that you have to align yourself with reality in a truthful manner, and that that's your best bet. And the biblical stories are actually quite realistic about that too, because they don't really say that if you do that, you're going to be instantly transported to the promised land. Like even Moses, as we'll find out in the Exodus stories, he never makes it to the promised land. And so it's not like you're offered instantaneous final redemption if you move out forthrightly into the world, establish a faithful relationship with being, and attempt to conduct yourself with integrity. But it's your best bet, and it might be good enough. And even if it's not good enough, it's really preferable to the alternative, which seems to be something closely akin to hell, both personal and social. So Joseph's father is Jacob, later Israel, he who wrestles with God. And we've talked about that a little bit. It's sort of implicit in what I've been saying, is that I think we all do that to some degree. We wrestle with reality itself, that's for sure. Not only the reality we understand, but the reality we don't understand, which is sort of a transcendent reality, and then maybe whatever reality is outside of that, because the classic Judeo-Christian conception of God is that there's time and space. And of course, there's lots of things about what exists in time and space that we're completely ignorant of, and that's transcendent in that sense. But then there's an idea that there's a realm outside of that, which is it's an interesting idea. It's a very sophisticated idea, I think, rather than a simple idea. And it's difficult to know what to make of it. But it doesn't really matter, because I think regardless of what your attitude is towards those sorts of things intellectually, you still end up in the same position as Jacob for all intents and purposes, practically speaking, because I don't think that there's anyone who at some point in their life, or perhaps even every day, doesn't at some level wrestle with God. And you could just call it, well, the nature of reality, I suppose, if you want to be, say, reductionistic about it, but I don't think it makes any difference. It's still something you're stuck with. And it's not only the nature of reality itself that you have to struggle with, but it's also the nature of your moral relationship to it, your behavioral relationship to it. So that's how you should perceive it and how you should conduct yourself. And then whether or not the advantages of doing it properly are worth the difficulty and the disadvantages. So that seems to me just a straight existential statement. And Jacob gets damaged by his wrestling, which is also very realistic. So, anyways, he also ends up as father of Joseph, who's the favorite son who's born in his old age to his favorite wife. And that's who we're going to talk about today. So you remember, so Jacob is the forefather of the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's his wives and the son, and the offspring that resulted. Those are all the sons. There's a daughter named Dinah as well. And Rachel is the woman he really loved, and the first son he had with Rachel was Joseph, and that was when he was older. And so that's in some sense why Joseph is his favorite. So this is the beginning of the story of Joseph. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And there's a lot packed into those two sentences, The first is that now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other children. That's probably not so good. One of the things we've seen in the stories that have preceded this is that whenever there's marked preference on the part of parents for one child over the other, with Jacob and Esau, it was Jacob was Rachel's favorite, and Esau was Isaac's favorite. That didn't work out so well. That put a real twist in the entire structure of the family. And so there's a warning there right off the bat. You might say, well, you can't help having a preference for one child over another, but I don't know if that's true, and it's certainly something that you should be very cautious about because it doesn't seem to work out very well. Because he was the son of his old age, fair enough, and he made him a coat of many colors. That's a very interesting image, that coat of many colors, that idea. And so I'm going to delve into that idea because it sets the stage. Like it says what sort of person Joseph is. He's favored, he's younger, he's favored, but he also has this particular garment that characterizes him. And one of the things I've really learned from analyzing women's dreams in particular is that women very frequently, in my experience, very frequently dream of clothing as role. And so if you're interpreting women's dreams, then if they put on the shoes of their grandmother, for example, then you understand very rapidly that the dream is trying to make an association between their own behavior and something that's characteristic of either the state of being a grandmother or the particular grandmother. And it makes sense, right? Because clothing protects, but it also signifies a role. And it's interesting in the Old Testament stories, often if someone is going to act deceitfully, they change their outfit. And that's kind of what you do when you act deceitfully, right? You dress up like someone else. You present yourself like someone else. So anyways, back to the coat of many colors. Well, for something to be many colored, it sort of spans the entire gamut of possibility. And so there's a hint there that if you want to be a full-fledged person, that you have to manifest a very large number of traits. And so I want to go into that idea a bit. The first thing I want to talk about is some of the things that we've learned about what happens to you when you go to a new environment. You know, there's this idea a very deep idea in clinical psychology, a fundamental idea, which is that if someone's anxious about something, what you do is and it's getting in their way, you take what they're anxious about and you define it, because that already delimits it, right? Because one of the problems with being anxious about something is you won't speak of it. It's like Voldemort. And then if you don't speak of it, it's way bigger than it should be. As soon as you start talking about it, you cut it down to size. And so, it's for a bunch of reasons. It's because you're not as afraid of as many things as you think, and you're braver than you know, and more capable. So as soon as you're brave enough to start talking about what you're afraid of, then you see that there's more to you than you thought, and that there's less to the problem than you thought. And then you can decompose it further into smaller problems, and then you can figure out how to approach those smaller problems. And then it doesn't seem to me to be that you get less frightened. It seems to be that you get more courageous, which is way better than being less frightened, because there's lots of things to be frightened about. So if you're courageous, that really does the trick. Now the question is, what happens if you, like, let's say that you're very socially inept and you don't know how to introduce yourself or to make establish the initial parts of a relationship with anyone. And so then you start putting yourself in situations where you're required to do that. And so then the question is, how is it technically that you transform? You say, well, you learn. Well, we want to be more specific about that. What does it mean that you learn? Well, if you're dealing with someone who's particularly socially inept and you're doing psychotherapy with them, you might teach them how to shake someone's hand properly and say their name and remember the other person's name. And so you just practice that with them so that they have the motoric routine down. So that form of knowledge is built right into your body. It's like, look at the person, put out your hand, shake it, not like a dead halibut, but with a reasonable grip. Say your name, don't mumble it, look at them so that they can hear you, and then when they say their name, try to remember it. And then so you can practice that with people, and so then they develop something that's motoric, right? It's embedded right in their body. And then you can say to them, well, the other thing you can do is when you start a conversation is don't sit there thinking about what you're going to say next, because then you won't be paying attention to the person and you'll make a fool out of yourself, because you'll manifest non sequiturs, right? Because you'll get out of, it's like if you're dancing and all you're paying attention to is where your feet are, then you're going to step on the other person all the time. So you want to pay attention to the other person, and then whatever automatized social knowledge you have will come to the forefront. So it's a good thing to know if you're socially anxious, right? If you're socially anxious, one of the things you should do is pay way more attention to the person you're talking to rather than less, and you should pay as little attention as possible to yourself. So if you feel yourself falling in because you're anxious, then what you do is you push your attention out and pay attention to the person, because to the degree that you've been socialized, then all your automatic responses will kick in. So, but anyway, so you go out into the social world and you learn to shake someone's hand, and you learn how to listen to them and ask them questions, because that's the next thing, because people love, you can't just ask them random questions, obviously, but if they start talking to you and you don't understand something about what they're saying, or maybe something they said is interesting and you ask them a question, they're pretty damn happy about that, because it means you're actually paying attention to them, and people actually love to be paid attention to because it hardly ever happens. So they really, really like it. And so, okay, so what's happening? Well, first of all, you're mastering the automated motor movements, right? Where to point your eyes, where to put your hands, how to move your lips, like really embodied knowledge. It's a special kind of memory, and you're practicing that. And so that's building new skills for you. And then by listening to the person and watching yourself interact, you're also generating new abstract information that enables you to conceptualize the world in a different way. So if you go out and talk to 10 different people or 50 different people, then you get to listen to what those 50 people said. You get to watch how they express themselves, and you gather a corpus of knowledge that changes the way you perceive, that broadens you as a social agent. Okay, so that's two forms of knowledge. But then there's a third one, which is really interesting, which is that, you have a lot of biological potential. And it's hard to know what potential is, but part of it is that you're capable of generating proteins that you haven't been generating. So you should get right on that, by the way. So, but the way that works in part is that if you put yourself in a radically new situation, then your brain, that there are genetic switches that turn on because of the demands of the new situation that code for new proteins. So it's as if you have latent software, that would be one way of thinking about it, that will only be turned on if you go into the situation where that's necessary. And so then you might think, well, if that's the case, how much of you could be turned on if you went a whole bunch of different places? And that's that's a profound question, because one of the deep answers to how you should get your life together is you should go a very large number of places and turn yourself on. And I want to walk through that a little bit, because there's a very rich symbolic world that expresses that. So now, the idea about having a coat of many colors would be that the person who is the appropriate leader, because remember, or the proper person, which would be the same thing, one of the things that these old stories are trying to express and to figure out is, how is it that you should act, which is the same as what constitutes the ideal. Those are the same question. And the hint here with Joseph is, well, you should wear a coat of many colors, which means that you should be able to go have a drink in the pub with the guys who are, drywalling your house, and you should be able to have a sophisticated conversation with someone who's more educated in an abstract way, and that maybe you should be equally comfortable in both situations, right? Because you might think, well, there's more. One of the indications that there's more to you is that you can be put more places and function properly. And that would be a good thing to aim at, because here's the other issue, is that you know perfectly well that the fundamental tragedies of life and your exposure to malevolence in the course of that life, so those being the worst things, there's not a lot you can do to alter that fundamentally, because they're conditions of existence. You're going to be subject to your vulnerability, and you're going to be subject to malevolence. That's that. And you can't hide from it, because it actually makes it worse. So you're stuck with it. So then the question is, well, what are your options? And one option is to curse the structure of being for being malevolent and tragic, and fair enough. And the other is to make yourself so damn differentiated and dynamic and able that you're more than a match for that. Now, that's not an easy thing, but doesn't matter, because, like, what's the alternative? There's no good alternative, and that's also worth knowing. So, you see these ideas expressed in the strangest places, and so we've talked a little bit, I think, in this series about Pinocchio, but if we haven't, it doesn't matter. You see, there's Jiminy Cricket at the opening of the Pinocchio movie, pointing to a star, which is roughly the nativity star for all intents and purposes, and it's a symbolic indicator of something diamond-like and pure, right? Glimmering in the darkness, that's transcendent and above the horizon, upon which to fix your eyes. And so and the thing is, you need that technically, and the reason you need that is because we know enough about psychology now to know that almost all of the positive emotion that you're going to experience in your life, and positive emotion is analgesic, by the way, right? It actually quells pain. So it's not just positive, it also gets rid of negative, which is a big plus. Almost all the positive emotion that you're going to feel in relationship to a goal, because you feel positive emotion as you approach a goal. And so if you want to feel positive emotion, then you need a goal. And then you might think, well, if you want to maximize that positive emotion, which is enthusiasm and also what pulls you out into the world, as well as feeling good, then you need the best possible goal? Well, because that's going to engage the largest segments of your being. Like if your goal is too narrow, then a bunch of you isn't going to be on board for it, you know? If the goal is well developed and multifaceted, then all of you can partake in that. Even your negative elements, even your anger and your fear can get on board with that, let's say. So you need a goal, man, that's worthy. You got to think, you need a goal that justifies the tragedy and malevolence of life. That seems to be the bottom line. Now, maybe you think, well, there's no goal that can do that. It's like, well, there are still better and worse goals. So, and I'm not convinced that there are no goals that can do that. I think that's an open question. You'd never know that until you pursued the proper goal long enough to find out who you would be as a consequence of pursuing it. So that's also your destiny or your existential voyage, right? It's also not something that anyone else can do for you. Someone can say, get your act together for Christ's sake and get at it. That'll make the world unfold best for you, but there's no way you can know that without doing it. So, and unless you think you've done a particularly stellar job of that, then you have no reason to doubt its potential validity. So plus, like, crickets are telling you this, and so, you know, they're a very reliable source. Okay, so you see the star recurs as a motif in Pinocchio, and one of the more interesting elements of it here is that when Geppetto wants to transform his puppet, the marionette, who's being played by forces that operate behind the scenes, which is a really good definition of the persona from a Jungian perspective, right? And also something indicative of something like an ideological or conceptual possession. Geppetto, who's a good guy, is a positive father figure, lifts his, even though he's a patriarchal figure, right, and a very competent one, he still even lifts his eyes up to something that transcends his mode of being, positive as it is, and wishes that his creation would undertake the kind of transformation that would make it autonomous and fully functional as a moral agent. No strings, right? So that's very interesting, I think. Solzhenitsyn said, the salvation of mankind lies only in making everything the concern of all. That's a pretty decent star-like goal, I would say. And so what happens in the Pinocchio story is that because, and I think this is a symbolic representative of what I just described to you that happens at a genetic level if you put yourself in new situations. So Geppetto is roughly culture in the Pinocchio story, right? He's a craftsman. And he makes Pinocchio. So he's who's his son. He's the socializing agent. And he aims for something above mere socialization, which is, I think, part of the mysterious element of human beings. You know, in our scientific models, we basically have socialization and biology. But there's always a third element in mythological stories, which is whatever you might construe as the spontaneous action of consciousness that's associated with free will. And, you know, that's just basically being conceptualized in religious terms as something akin to the soul. Now, we don't have a category for that scientifically, because what we try to do scientifically is to reduce everything either to socialization or to biology. But it isn't clear to me that it's perfectly reasonable from the perspective of practicality at a scientific level. You don't want to multiply explanatory principles beyond necessity. But there's many things that doesn't come to terms with, such as the fact that we all treat each other as autonomous beings with free will, and that seems to work, and that if we stop doing that, then things go to hell very, very rapidly. So, and the mere fact that we have been able to conceptualize what that conscious free will might be, metaphysically or physically, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that we don't understand it. I mean, it was only in the last 15 years that we discovered that 95% of the universe was made out of some kind of matter that we can't even, whose properties we can't even imagine, except that it seems to have mass. So, anyways, what happens is when Geppetto lifts his eyes up to the star, so it's society aligning itself with the proper goal with regards to individual development, right? So instead of society being at odds with the individual, they line up. And then what happens is nature comes on board. And that's the blue fairy in in the Pinocchio story, and that seems to me to be a symbolic representation of what happens biologically when you set the goal properly, get your culture behind you and move into the world, is that there's a biological transformation that occurs as a consequence of that, which means that a bunch of you that hasn't been turned on turns on. And I guess one question would be is, what would you be like if you turned on everything inside of you that could be turned on? Well, that's a good goal. That's a good thing to find out. So now I'm going to introduce a couple of other ideas. So there's this idea in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation. And Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be. And that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximal development. Now, it sounds like a metaphysical idea or a mystical idea even, but it's not. It's not. It's a really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, like, there's nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case? Unless there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that is what the situation would be. It's kind of interesting to think about how that would be manifest moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that lead you down the path of development. Well, that better be the case. Okay, so that's fine. And so there's some utility in pursuing those things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. So, and the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, like, what the hell do you know? You might be interested in things that are kind of warped and bent. And often it's the case that when new parts of people manifest themselves and grip their interests, say, they do it very badly and shoddily. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is the precursor to the savior from the symbolic perspectives, because you have to be a fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be a fool, then you can't be a master. So you're going to, it's an error-ridden process. And that's also laid out in the Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens to all these patriarchal figures when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84 is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social and some of it's natural and some of it's a consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So they're fools. But the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're fools, they're still supposed to go on the adventure, and that they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this. So this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely. Highly likely. So you have, there's, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being, you know, you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's the continual message that echoes through these historical stories in Genesis. It's like, these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before they did. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence. But it's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. And that's great. So that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually. Because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear. There's a great TED talk, I think it was, about this guy set up a really advanced computational recording system in his home and recorded every single utterance his young child made while learning to speak. And then he put together the child's attempts to say certain phonemes and put them in a list, and you can hear the child deviating madly to begin with, and then after hundreds and hundreds of repetitions, just zeroing right in on the exact phoneme. So, you might not know this, but when kids babble, because they start babbling when they're quite young, they babble every human phoneme, including all sorts of phonemes that adults can't say. And then they die into their language, so that after they learn, say, English, then there's all sorts of phonemes they can no longer hear or pronounce. But to begin with, it's all there, which is really quite interesting. But so as they learn a particular language, they zero in on the proper way to pronounce that, and their errors minimize. And every time you learn something, that's how it is. And that's really useful to know, too, because it means that it's okay to wander around stupidly before you fix your destination. Now, you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens is that the Egyptians, or the Hebrews, escape a tyranny, which is kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidly held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like, away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you think, well, now I'm on the way. It's, no, you're not. Now you're in the desert, where you wander around stupidly, and worship the wrong things until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that's worth knowing, too, because you think, well, I got rid of a lot of things, excess baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything's okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffolds that were keeping you in place, even though they were pathological. And now you have nothing, and nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, but you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It's that you escape from a tyranny, it's hooray, we're no longer slaves. Yeah, well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement. But it is see, it's also useful to know that, because you can also be deluded into the idea that, imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all those parts of you on that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just a linear pathway uphill. You know, it's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like, here you are and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a complete bloody catastrophe. It's worse. And then maybe you can pull yourself together and you hit a new plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes, and bang, it's worse again. And so, because part of the reason that people don't become enlightened is because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. You know, let's say if you have to get out of a bad relationship. It's like there isn't any relationship that's 100% bad. And so when you jump out of it, well, maybe you're in better shape, but you're still lonesome and disoriented, and you don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with the devil they know instead of, you know, looking for the devil they don't know. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because like, what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful. Okay, so like if you were an efficient person, you would have just done that. But you're not. But who cares? You know, you still end up in the same place. And maybe the trip is even more interesting. Who knows? Probably too interesting. Jung. I began to understand that the goal of psychic development, by which he means psychological development or spiritual development, is the self. There's no linear evolution. There's only a circumambulation of the self, a getting closer. It's like you're spiraling into something. Something like that. And the thing that you're spiraling into recedes as you move towards it and gets more and more sophisticated and well-developed as you move towards it. Because you're not going to run out of goals, right? No matter how much you have your act together, there's probably, undoubtedly, 30 dimensions along which you could get your act together a lot more. So, and some of those aren't even conceivable to you when you're in your initial uncarved state, let's say. Uniform development exists at most at the beginning. Later, everything points towards the center. This insight gave me stability, and gradually my inner peace returned. So this is fun. On the left there, that's the Chartres Cathedral. That's the one that has the maze in it that I told you about. They actually light that up with lasers now. And so that's it lit up with lasers. And so they're turning it into a cathedral of light, which I think is really fascinating. And it's a continuation of the same idea, right? Because the stained glass windows were obviously, I wouldn't call them primitive attempts to do that. I mean, stained glass windows are pretty impressive, you know, but it's an elaboration of the same thing. So now you can go to that cathedral. They light up the whole town like that, which is really something. And so there's how the cathedral is built. It's a cross. And you remember, the cross is an X that marks the center of the world, and the cross is the place where each individual is. And I think that's the fundamental message of Christianity, is the cross marks the place where every single individual is. And it's a tragic place that consists of suffering and exposure to malevolence, and that the only way to come to terms with it is to accept it. And that seems to me, I don't see anything metaphysical about that statement whatsoever. It's like, well, X marks the spot, fair enough. You're in a spot, You're right in the center of your world. It's right in the center of the world as far as you're concerned, and the same with the rest of us. It's characterized by suffering and exposure to malevolence. There's no doubt about that. What are you going to do about that? Bitter, resentful, hateful? All that does is make it worse. So you have to accept it. Now that's not an easy thing, because that's actually, I would say, a heroic task to voluntarily accept the conditions of your own existence. And that happens at the cross. So that's fine. And that's associated with light. Well, that's good that that's associated with light. You wouldn't want that to be associated with darkness. That would be a bad thing. So and so there's the labyrinth. That was built in 1200 AD. And so the idea is you walk in here. It's the same idea as that star sequence of slides that I just showed you. So here's the idea, is that north, south, west, and east. So that's the whole world laid out in 2 dimensions. And so the question is, how do you get to the center? Now, we already know what the center is. The center is the center of the cross. That's the place of maximal suffering. You could say maximal malevolence as well. But it's also the place where that's transcended. So how do you get there? Well, the answer is, well, you don't just stand on the outside looking in. That's not going to help. So, and you can't just run right to the center, even if you're in California. And so you have to walk in here, and then you see, you go like this, and you go to every single place on that little cosmos. And then once you've gone to every single place and expanded yourself as a consequence of going north and west and east and south, then there's enough of you so that you can tolerate being, first of all, that you can figure out where the center is, but also that you can tolerate being at the center. And so that's what that represents. That's pretty, and look, I mean, let's make no mistake about it, hey? People were pretty damn serious about those ideas. Like that's quite the piece of work for people in the 12th century. You know, some of those damn cathedrals took 300 years to build. We don't build anything that takes 300 years. You know, people were putting a lot of effort into whatever these things meant. You know, and if you think they meant bearded man in the sky, then, you know, it's hard to account for the kind of motivation that would produce these buildings with that kind of paucity of conceptualization. You know, the towns, and it was certainly the case in Chartres, is that they groaned under the tax burden that was required to produce these. Now, you might think, well, that's partly tyrannical, and no doubt that's the case, but that's not the whole story. The whole story is that the people who produced those buildings, they thought about every bit of it. Nothing's accidental. And they're trying to portray something, just like that window is trying to portray something. That's the same thing as this. It's the center from which all things manifest themselves. You see, that's Christ there, and being portrayed as that center, or the center within him, something like that. Very much like the chakras in yogic practice. Same basic idea. It's the opening up of the internal structure and its proper realization. So there are people walking the labyrinth. So that's the coat of many colors, right? That's this differentiated mode of being that enables you to be competent and at home in the widest possible number of places. And that's a real differentiation of your personality. It's a breaking through the boundaries of your personality, including the ones that you impose on yourself, to become someone who's useful wherever they're put. And that's really relevant to this story of Joseph too, because one of the things that happens to Joseph is that, well, a lot of bad things happen to him. Because he's the favorite of his father, his brothers hate him. And so first they're going to throw him in a pit. I think they do throw him in a pit. Then they sell him to be a slave. Then he ends up in, well, we'll go through the story. He ends up some places where you probably wouldn't want to go, prison being one of them. But it doesn't matter, because even when they put him in prison, he's actually not in prison. He just figures out how to make the prison work way better. And then he's in control of the prison. And it's an interesting, I had this friend, and he was very smart, but very cynical. And he wasn't employed very well, and he got a little older than he should have given his level of intelligence and employability. And so he had to take jobs that weren't very intellectually challenging. And one of the things I tried to convince him of was that even if he wanted to work behind the parts department in an automotive store because he liked cars. But it was beneath him, because it was sort of as far as he was concerned, he was too smart for a job like that, which actually turned out not to be true. He wasn't smart enough for a job like that, or he wasn't wise enough. But one of the things I tried to tell him was that you're looking at the situation wrong, because even in a simple job, so-called simple job, like let's say dishwashing in a restaurant, which I did an awful lot of, it's not that simple. You're dealing with a lot of other people, very fast staff changeover. You're feeding people, you're helping them have a celebration, you're helping them take a break. Like, you can do it really well. And then the kitchen can operate properly, and then people can come out to the restaurant, and it's not a bloody catastrophe. And like, even when you're doing something that's a menial job, so to speak, like dishwashing, there are ways of doing it really badly, resentfully and horribly, and doing it really well. And as soon as you do it really well, it's not a menial job anymore. It immediately transforms. Now, I mean, you can be around people who won't let that happen, and you should go get another job if that's the case. But if you do it properly, then it's not menial at all. And that's also a good way out of resentment. You think, well, I've just got this, 2-bit job. It's like, yeah, what if you did it as well as you possibly could? What would happen? Well, the first thing that would happen is you'd get a lot smarter. That's for sure. And that's hardly a negative thing. Okay. So that's the coat of many colors. So it's an intimation of what Joseph is like. And what we're seeing with all of these patriarchal figures is the continual realization of the ideal person, right? You could think about it as successive approximations of the ideal person. And the story is exploring all sorts of different possibilities, including ones that are very violent and catastrophic and malevolent. It's trying to cover the entire territory and to focus in on what's the proper way through the maze of life, the labyrinth. And the hint here is that, well, you should be multidimensional. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Well, we already know that Joseph is Jacob's favorite, and so that doesn't make him very popular among his brothers. He's younger, and now we also find out that he's been set up more or less as, you might say, a snitch. Because that's what this phrase means, is that he goes out and watches his older brothers, and if they do something they shouldn't do, then he comes trotting back to Jacob and reports. Well, that's not going to make you popular. So, and you would say, well, is that Joseph's problem or Jacob's problem? And I would say, and this is something I learned from reading Jung too, is that that's a conspiratorial problem, right? It's the parents at fault, but so is the child who agrees to do that. They've got a little cabal going. And you might say, well, it's only the parents' fault, but the son will be taking advantage of every advantage that offers him. Because he could say, no, too, I won't do that. So anyway, Joseph is the favorite. He's a bit of a teacher's pet. That's what it looks like. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his colors because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. So let's say you have a child or a number of children, and one of them is your favorite. How should you treat that child? Well, it isn't obvious that you do them any favors by overtly making them your favorite, right? I mean, first of all, maybe you don't challenge them as much as you should. And second of all, you definitely set up a Cain and Abel-like scenario in the household. And that, or maybe it's an Oedipal situation too, because you happen to love your child more than you love your spouse, that's not a recipe for familial harmony. So it seems to be a bad idea. Okay, so now we have two reasons that Joseph is not liked by his brothers. One is, well, he's a bit of a rat fink, and the other is that he's the favorite, and he's playing that to the hilt by the looks of things. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Okay. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him the more. He said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding wheat sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose. And behold, your sheaf stood round about and bowed to my sheaf. And remember, he's the young one, right? And also the daughter of the favorite wife, which is another thing or the son of the favorite wife, which is another thing not really working in his favor. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Well, there's a shock. That makes perfect sense. And it gets worse. So you see here, well, there's the wheat sheaves bowing there. And then you see this, what's going on here? Well, that's not the end of his, let's call it grandiosity. And there's an idea too in the Old Testament, especially in the stories of Joseph, that if God sends you a dream twice, he really means it. And so I don't know if that's true, although I do know that people have repeating dreams. It might be true that a dream you have twice is really trying to punch something home. It's certainly the case that recurrent nightmares are meaningful, and that recurrent nightmares are associated quite tightly with decreased states of mental health, and that if you can treat the nightmare, which is often quite easy, by the way, then some of the mental health problems will decrease. So repeated dreams seem to be important. Anyways, he dreamed yet another dream and told it to his brethren and said, Behold, I've had another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed to me. And he told it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. Well, what the hell do you make of something like that, right? If someone tells you that, it's like, are they responsible for their dreams? We don't really hold ourselves responsible for the dreams we have at night. And what do you make of a dream is like one of the things that Jung pointed out. This is where he differed from Freud substantially. Is Freud tended to think that the dream hid its meaning because its contents weren't acceptable to the conscious mind. And Jung said, no, you don't understand. That's not what happens. What happens is the dream is doing the best it can to express something that the person doesn't yet really know. And Jung thought about the dream as a manifestation of nature. It wasn't associated with the ego at all. It was just like you have a dream and there are things happening in it the same way that when you walk into a dinner party, there are things happening there. It's not, the dream isn't something that's subject to your capacity for manipulation. It's something that happens to you, not something that you do. And so if someone has a dream like that, well, you've got three options. You can just discount dreams altogether, which is what people in the modern world tend to do, which is a very bad idea because they're thoughts and you shouldn't discount them, and they're hardly random, as some neuroscientists claim. That's absolutely cockeyed theory, that random. Be like television snow on a TV set if it was random. So one is, well, you just discount dreams. The other is that you consider the person a liar and a braggart and a narcissist. And the third is, well, what's the third? It's like he dreamt that the sun and the moon and the stars bowed down to him. You might think about that 2 or 3 times. But it's not necessarily something that's going to make you happy. And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, so they took off. And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto him. And he said to him, Here am I. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. Rough people back then, right? This sort of thing is happening quite frequently. And they said to one another, Behold, the dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit. And we will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams. So there's an echo of the Cain and Abel story there, obviously. It's not quite as clear because in the Cain and Abel story, Abel is clearly just doing well. And here you can't quite get a handle on Joseph's character. You can't tell if he is actually the elect or if he's just a spoiled brat with delusions of grandeur, but it doesn't matter because his brothers are so irritated at the fact that he's favored, and perhaps even the fact that he might be someone destined for something special, that they find it perfectly reasonable to destroy that. And it's so interesting how often that motif of pulling down an ideal manifests itself in these old stories, right? The pattern is established in the Cain and Abel story. It just repeats and repeats and repeats. And I think that's dead true. I think it just repeats all the time. It's that people are annoyed about how tragic their lives are. They're annoyed that they're subject to malevolence, and they're annoyed that they're not doing as well as other people are doing. And that puts them exactly into this state of mind. Now, maybe with modern people, if you're going to kill someone because you're resentful as a modern person, you don't generally slay them and throw them into a pit. What you do is you just kill them slowly over a few decades. And it isn't obvious to me that that's any better. So I've seen plenty of married couples who are in that situation. It's like, there was this Mitch Hedberg, he used to complain about turtlenecks. He said it was like being strangled by a really weak midget. And it's probably a really politically incorrect joke, but it's a funny joke. So, and then you see relationships that are like that. It's like each person has their hands around the neck of the other person, but they don't have enough courage to squeeze. They just put enough pressure on to cut the circulation off a tiny bit. So the person just gets they die over a 30-year period, something like that. So, yeah, and you all laugh because you know it's true. That's why. And we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, which would be true, actually. It would be the evil beast that's inside the brothers. And we shall see what will become of his dreams. Ha ha. That's interesting too, because so they want to spite themselves because maybe Joseph is something special, and then they want to spite their father, which is probably not the wisest idea because they owe him some gratitude. I mean, maybe he's acting like a pain in the neck. There's some evidence for that, but this is a little bit harsh. But they also want to spite God, just like Cain did, because that's what it means. We shall see what will become of his dreams, right? Because then as soon as you're, in some sense, trying to fight against the intuition of someone, the natural intuition of someone, you've set yourself up against the structure of being itself. And so, pretty bad. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered them out of their hands and said, "No, let us not kill him." And Reuben said unto them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that's in the wilderness." It's like Reuben's the good guy in this story. And there's no water in the pit, by the way. And lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. So Reuben was actually trying to save him, so that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. And it came to pass when Joseph came unto his brethren that they stripped him of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it. And then they sat down to eat bread and lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, "How does it profit us if we kill our brother and conceal his blood?" So he's the practical guy here. So what? Why would we kill him when we can sell him? It's like, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. And his brethren were content. Then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. It's an amount that echoes through into the future. And they brought Joseph into Egypt. I'm never really sure how these slavery stories work. It's like, so it's 2,500, 3,000 years ago, and I decide I'm going to sell you to the Ishmaelites, and that just works out. I get the money, you get to be a slave, and they take you away. I don't really understand how that works. I can't figure out how people weren't just selling each other all the time. But maybe if you're family, you can do it. So there they sold him. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not there, and Reuben rent his clothes. So Reuben's very upset about this. And he returned unto his brothers and said, the child is not, and where shall I go? And they conspired. They took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. That's interesting too, because blood is actually another color, right? So he's got this coat of many colors, and blood is definitely a color. And so this is the addition, in some sense, of the color of blood to Joseph's coat. And I would say it's probably a necessary color, because I don't think that you're serious enough till your coat has been dipped in blood. That can happen in many ways. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, so they lied to him. It's very, very nasty business, this. They sell his son to slavery. They claim that he's dead. They lie to him. They put him into an extreme state of grief. There's a lot of hatred underneath that, right? A tremendous amount of hatred for Joseph and also for Jacob. This we have found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or not. And he knew it. He said, it's my son's coat. An evil beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for many days. And all his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, I'll go down into my grave mourning my son. Thus his father wept for him. So that's Jacob collapsing at the news. And the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So now he's a slave. So now you'd think, well, this is a man who has a lot of reason to be irritated at the structure of reality, right? He's gone from being the favorite to being betrayed by all of his brothers. That's pretty rough. And then he's being transformed into a slave, and now he's being sold to work as a slave. So you'd think that would corrupt his character. Because, one of the things, I think this is the case anyways, I think people are always looking for an excuse to have their character corrupted. Because if your character is corrupted, then you get to lie, and you get to cheat, and you get to steal, and you get to betray, and you get to act resentfully, and you get to do nothing, and that's all easy. It's easier to lie than to tell the truth. It's easier to do nothing than to do something. So there's always part of you thinking, well, I need a justification for being useless and horrible, because that'd be a lot less work. And so then if something terrible comes along, you think, aha, that's just exactly the excuse that I was waiting for. And then out all that comes. Solzhenitsyn, when he was in the concentration camps in Russia, watching how people behaved, he said that there were people that were put in the camps who immediately became trustees or guards, and they were even more vicious than the people who had been hired as guards. And his idea was that they had collected all that, he called it foulness, if I remember correctly, around them in normal life. But they didn't have the opportunity to express it. But as soon as you gave them the opportunity, it was like, there it was, right away. And so one of the messages that seems to echo through these Old Testament stories is that just because something terrible happens to you doesn't mean that you get to wander off the path and make things worse. And maybe it doesn't matter how terrible it is that what happens to you. And that's a tough call, because you see people now and then in life who they've really got it rough, man. Like 50 bad things are happening to them at the same time. And you think, oh, it's no wonder. If you were bitter and resentful and hostile, it'd be like, yeah, no wonder. But then you meet people, and Solzhenitsyn again talked about this in the Gulag Archipelago. He said he met lots of people not lots. He met enough people to impress him in the concentration camp system who didn't allow their misfortunes to corrupt them. And that's something, man. Because maybe the only real misfortune is to become corrupted. That's a really useful thing to think. Maybe the rest of it is trivial in comparison. I know that's a rough thing because you can be in very harsh circumstances, but I do think there's something to that. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So that's an echo of the idea that we encountered earlier about walking with God, right? So Adam walked with God before he ate the fruit with Eve, and then he wouldn't walk with God. And then Noah walked with God, and Abraham walked with God. And so the idea is, well, that's that alignment with the highest ideal. I think it's something like that. And you know, we could think about that as a metaphysical claim as well. But I don't think it is. I mean, I've got thousands of letters now in the last year from people who have told me that they were in a pit. That's exactly right. And that they decided that they were going to try to put their lives together. And that it worked. And so that's really something, you know, and they write surprised. It's like, well, I decided that I was going to work hard at what I was doing and I wasn't going to lie any more than absolutely necessary. I thought I'd give it a try for a few months, you know. And all sorts of good things started to happen to me. It's like, maybe that's how the world works. Now, obviously, it doesn't work like that all the time, right? Because you can get sliced off at the knees. I mean, there's an arbitrary element to existence that you can't wish away. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there aren't bad strategies and good strategies. And so, I do think that one of the most fundamental existential questions is, like, if things aren't going well for you in your life is, are you absolutely certain that you're doing absolutely everything you can to put things in order? Because if you're not, then you shouldn't complain. Because you don't know to what degree you're actually contributing or even causing the circumstance. Now that's a very annoying thing to think, and I'm not trying to blame the victim. You know, I know that people end up with lung cancer because they were exposed to asbestos, you know. I'm not trying to, although I also know too that if you have lung cancer because you've been exposed to asbestos, that can be a tragedy or it can be hell, and to some degree that depends on how you conduct yourself. So, I mean, I know that's pretty gloomy possibilities, right? But so anyway, so Joseph is a slave, but it turns out that he hasn't sacrificed the integrity of his character, and so it turns out that he's not a slave. It's just that everyone around him thinks he's a slave, but he's not. So that's pretty interesting. He was a goodly person and well favored. Well, so he's a good guy, and he's an impressive specimen as well. This is pretty interesting given the current political climate, I would say. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." That means, that actually has two meanings, right? But he refused. And said unto his master's wife, "Behold, my master does not know what's with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There's no one greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me, but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or be with her. It's being sexually harassed, Joseph. And it came to pass, well, it's right. I mean, look at the painting. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. So that's kind of embarrassing for poor Joseph, I would say, and a bit on the suspicious side. And it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. So, what is it? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. That's the proper commentary on that. And it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got himself out. And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, so that's the Pharaoh, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me. His wrath was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. And he was there in the prison. Well, that sort of sucks. It's like, first his brothers betray him and throw him in a pit, and then he gets made a slave, which is probably better than being in the pit, and then he becomes sort of like king slave, so that's working out pretty well. And now someone lies about him, he gets betrayed again, and now it's into the prison with him. And so it's this again, right? It's the same thing. It's Sisyphus up with the rock and then down, and it's order, chaos, and then you have to think, well, are you the order, or are you the chaos, or are you the thing that's moving between them? Because that's the right thing to be.